Now we're going to be talking about the committee structure in Congress, video Congress 05. Now, both of the chambers, when I talk about the chambers, I'm talking about the House and the Senate, right? They're each separate chambers. They both together make up Congress. Both of them are organized in the exact same way. They both rely very much on committees. And members of the House serve on the committees in the House, and members of the Senate serve on the committees in the Senate. There are some committees where they both sit together, but they're relatively unimportant. We're really talking about how the House functions and how the Senate functions both together, and they're both structured in the same way. In both bodies, most of the work is done in committees. In other words, what they don't do, here's what they don't do in the House of Representatives. Remember do you remember how many representatives are in the House? How many members of the House are there? 435, right? There are 435 members of the House. So imagine if you're trying to pass bills having to do with agriculture, you have to pass a bill having to do with education, you have to pass a bill dealing with the environment, and then you have to pass a bill having to do with the armed forces. Imagine if you had to get all 435 people together and say, hey, you guys, okay, we're all going to be working on this bill on agriculture, and then everybody starts giving their input and talking and yakking and make ideas and suggestions, changing the bill, adding stuff to the bill, and then finally when you get it done, then all 435 of you move over to the next topic. It would be impossible to get anything done that way. Just imagine trying to get something done inside a classroom, like a face-to-face classroom. You had 35 people. If you had 5 tasks that needed to be done, would it be easier to get all 35 people working on each task, or would it be easier to say, okay, look, 6 of you start on this, 7 of you work over here, and divide it up? Well, that's what they do in Congress. They divide it up. So most of the work that's done in Congress is done in committee. The main thing they do is write bills, right? Because that's, remember we said their primary job is lawmaking, so most of the lawmaking that gets written happens in the committees first. Now, after a bill gets, if I was hearing a squeaking sound, most of the work that's done in committee, a bill gets written and debated and discussed in a committee, and then once the committee passes the bill, it goes to what's called the floor. When I talk about the floor, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, that's when I'm talking about everybody voting. So a bill, for example, a bill on that has to deal with agriculture starts off in the agricultural committee. There'll be people on this committee who just sort of deal with anything that has to do with agriculture, and they debate the bill and they discuss the bill. And then if a majority of people in the committee say, yeah, we like this bill, then it moves to what's called the floor. And that's when all 435 people would have an opportunity to vote on it. So even if you're not on the agriculture committee, if you're a member, I just made you a member of Congress, congratulations. Even if you're a member of Congress and maybe you're not on the agricultural committee, but there's a bill dealing with agriculture, while you won't be involved in the committee debating it and discussing how it's going to be written and all that, when it comes time for it to become a bill and then to get passed to become a law, you'll have a chance to vote when they bring the bill out of committee. That's what it's called. We're bringing the bill out of committee to the floor. And what that just means that phrase out of committee and to the floor just means that the committee has already agreed to it, and now everybody in the House of Representatives is going to get a chance to vote on the bill. This is true in the Senate as well. A bill will be debated in committee, meaning just like in this case, if it's a bill having to do with agriculture, it'll be debated by the Agriculture Committee in the Senate. And if the majority of the people in the Senate in the committee approve of it, then it goes to the floor and all 100 members of the Senate get to vote for it. So that's how most bills are passed in Congress. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. Most of the work that's done is done in committees. The committees do most of the work. And also another thing that happens in committees, these oversight hearings that I told you about in the last video, these oversight hearings, these happen in committee too. So if there's a bill, and I'm going to I always use agriculture as an example just because it's easy. So I'm just going to stick with it. But this is true of all the other committees in the House and in the Senate, and there are a whole bunch of them. The Oversight Committee, if there's a bill that gets passed that has to do with agriculture, when we talk about how a bill becomes a law, we'll be talking about Phil's corn law. I just make up a fake law on my corn law, so Phil's corn law. If Congress passes, if I'm a member of Congress and I say I want to write a law that deals with growing of corn, and so I go ahead and I bring it in a committee, and the committee debates it, and they say, hey, Phil, we really like this bill, and the majority of people vote for it. Then it goes to the House, and a majority of people in the House, they vote for it, and then it goes to the Senate, and it becomes a law. Then after it becomes a law, once it stops being Phil's corn bill, and it becomes Phil's corn law, right? Then what happens is I'm going to go ahead and want to know and make sure that the executive branch is carrying out my law the way I wanted them to. I want to make sure that they're not doing something underhanded, or they're not ignoring my bill and like, don't worry about that one. We'll take care of that later on. So that'll happen in committee too. In a committee, I'll call in people from the agricultural department, people who work for the president, and I'll say, tell me how things are going. How are you carrying out the law? So that's happens in committee as well. Now, every committee is headed by a chairperson. Basically the guy who's in charge. And the chairperson exercises significant control over the agenda. And what I mean by the agenda, you can see how the agenda is italicized. When I talk about the agenda, what that basically means is the chairperson of the committee pretty much gets to decide what the committee is going to debate and what the committee isn't going to debate, what bills the committee is going to look at and which ones the committee is not going to look at. So if I want to pass Phil's corn law and the chairman of the agriculture committee hates my bill, the chances of me getting that bill passed are very, very slim. It's very unlikely that I'm going to get a bill passed, because if the chairman doesn't want, the chairman can control basically what happens in a committee. Okay, and that's really important to remember, because committee chairmen wind up being very important. Now, there are a variety of different types of committees in Congress. We're just going to talk about two, but there are significantly more than two. But I'm going to talk about the two main ones. The first and most important kind of committee is called a standing committee or a permanent committee. And there are a whole bunch of permanent committees, both in the House and in the Senate. These permanent committees each have what I call jurisdiction over a specific area. And what I mean by jurisdiction is the committee has control over specific areas. So I've been talking a lot about the Agricultural Committee. If a bill is going to be, if I have this idea that I want to go ahead and I want to write a bill that has something to do with regulating the growing of corn, or the selling of corn, or the transportation of corn, that bill is probably going to be debated in the Agricultural Committee. But let's say I have a bill that goes ahead and regulates how much money banks have to have in store so that if the economy takes a dive, they can still pay out their debts. Well, that's not something that's going to be debated in the Agricultural Committee, because banks aren't plants. They aren't agriculture. So that would be handled by another committee. If I have a bill that has to do with the armed forces, building a jet, or building a new tank, or something like that, or how much money we're going to give, how much money we're going to pay the troops, that's not going to be handled in the Agricultural Committee either. That's going to be handled in a committee that deals with the armed forces. So every committee has its own jurisdiction. And if there's a bill having to do with agriculture, the Armed Services Committee won't be able to debate that bill, right? That's going to come to the Agricultural Committee. So every committee has its own jurisdiction, and there are these permanent standing committees, right, in Congress. There are a whole bunch of committees: Committee on Agriculture, the Committee on Banking, there's a Committee on Armed Services, there's a Committee on Education, there's a committee on it's called Committee on the Interior. It deals with like sort of dams and floodplains in the United States. There are small business committees. There's a veterans committee. So there's all kinds of committees, and they're committees in the House, and they basically match up. They're not named the same thing sometimes, but for every House committee, there's usually a corresponding Senate committee. They're not, but sometimes they have different names. So this is the way Congress works. It works mostly in committees, and each of these committees has its own jurisdiction. So in the next video, I'm going to give you an example of the kind of committees that I'm talking about. So you're going to want to have your browser out, because you're going to click on some links here. I'm trying to turn this thing off, but there we go.